Hello and welcome to a new video where I just kind of wanted to talk about the new Nightsworn path. If you didn't know, recently, I think yesterday, Red Hook released a new patch where like all of the Grave Robber paths and all of the Highwayman paths got reworked, and they all got some balance changes as well. So I just kind of wanted to talk about Nightsworn specifically. Just to preface this, I think all of the other stuff that got changed is really nice. I think the new Highwayman paths all feel great. Deadeye Venom Drop both feel great, but Nightsworn is kind of the odd one out, and you will probably realize this very quickly, that I don't really agree with the way Nightsworn got rebalanced. And this video is kind of just to like talk about what I think is very bad about the rework and why I think it just doesn't work, and why Nightsworn in its earlier state before the rework was better, in my opinion. So, time to go over the changes first. Obviously, all of the just instant changes that like just got applied over the path got removed. This was the plus damage while stealthed and the minus 20% max HP. This is fine. The minus 20% max HP is, yeah. It's a slight increase in HP. I think if you had this was like, you had like 25 or 23 HP or something, which obviously wasn't great, but Grave Robber is still very fragile, where like you have to rely on her not dying and then being able to like press one of these two heals to like really get a lot of HP back. And that's kind of how she survives, or obviously you just get into stealth and then you stay in stealth and you don't get hit. So this is kind of like a, yeah, sure, it's a nice buff. It's a little bit better, but not a huge deal. But the stealth plus damage is a huge loss. Like, this made her very flexible with what she could do. Her range stuff is actually still very good, because plus 50% damage pretty much outclasses what the other two paths did, while not being as spammable as like Deadeye. And that meant you could just run Throne Dagger or like all of the other range stuff, just go into stealth and hit for plus 50% damage, which is really good. I still think Deadeye, specifically old Deadeye, or like even new Deadeye, are still better for consistent damage, where like you just press Throne Dagger every turn, or like you press your stuff every turn. It's consistent, but Nightsworn had that option before, where you just went into stealth and then you realize, oh, there's a really dangerous backline and I don't really have a good launch target, so you just press Throne Dagger and still deal good damage. Like, this can actually hit for very big numbers if you have plus 50% damage, because that's a lot. Plus 50% damage should not be underestimated. There's very few options, or like just single things that give you plus 50% damage. Like, even with two trinkets, it's difficult to get plus 20% damage. Because the best I can think of is like you have that Sharpening Charm, which gives you plus 20% damage, and you have one of the two plus 20% damage if you miss, you gain one stress. Raven's Reach and I think Gnarly Knuckles. Those two you get plus 40% damage. And that's still not as much as old Nightsworn used to get. Like, plus 50% damage is a big deal. Like, don't think that this is like, oh yeah, it's a small buff, you kind of want to be in stealth more. Like, you, with Nightsworn before, you needed stealth to make the path work. Like, the stealth was so big. Plus 50% damage is insane. That's like a permanent strength token. And losing that is insanely impactful. Like, just losing that would mean that you would have to basically buff her entire kit to make up for that, because that was a huge loss. And as you can already probably tell, that didn't exactly happen. So, moving on. One of the bigger changes from like Wanderer, which mainly affects Wanderer, like the other two paths also have Pirouette, but this stays the same in Nightsworn now. It isn't affected at all. And Pirouette essentially got its damage reduced for Nightsworn and got a bit of utility instead. And that's terrible. Like, Pirouette was one of your two main damage moves, because earlier, like before the rework, your core of moves was basically Shadow Fade, Lunge, and Pirouette. These were your three main moves. You wanted to press these very often. Then you had one flex move for range, which was usually Glint in the Dark or Throne Dagger. Then you had one heal move, which was Dead of Night or Absinthe. So this was one of your two main damage moves. And this not being affected anymore, and essentially just being 4 to 7 or 6 to 9 damage to two people, is terrible. Because before, this was actually very good damage. It got a small damage increase, just for like every path, not just for Nightsworn specifically. But it's not nearly enough to make up for the lost plus 50% damage that this used to give. Instead, you get, you daze yourself and you weaken yourself. And if you are in stealth, you don't get those debuffs. You just move back and you deal a bit of damage, and yeah. And upgraded, you apply the daze and the weaken to both enemies. This overall is less of like a nerf, because you technically did lose a bit of damage, or like a lot of damage. Really, it's not just a bit. You lost a lot of damage. Another thing you lost is the dodge. But if you master this is actually really good disruption, because 2 days specifically is really good. Because any other daze attack basically turns this daze into a stun, and that's huge. Like, Pirouette is actually pretty decent. It's worse for Nightsworn specifically, in my opinion, because until you have this mastered, it's pretty much just weaker, because you are dealing less damage, and losing the daze, you don't get daze anymore, is nice, I guess. But at the same time, it's less flexible, because you have your Arna and Stealth. This is just a downgrade. Like, this is terrible. Because you have very bad follow-up then, because you are all the way in the back, so Lunge is taking that weak token. That's not great for the damage. And you still get dazed, and the damage is obviously lower. So that's not great. And the other thing that is lost is the dodge. And the dodge being lost is terrible. Because what you used to do with Nightsworn was you press Shadow Fade. Next action you press Lunge. Lunge takes down Stealth by 1, so you have 1 Stealth left. And then on the next action, you press Pirouette, you go all the way back, you generate a dodge token, you lose your Stealth, and then you have at least that dodge token to make your turn where you are dazed a bit more safer. Now you don't have that daze, so you can act faster again, but this is still a loss, because then from there, you only have Lunge or Repartie or your other stuff, and you can't get into Stealth again, and that's not great. So losing that dodge really hurts, because you don't have that extra layer of defense anymore. That's kind of why this sucks. Overall, I think Pirouette is fine being changed like this, because it's not really a nerf, it's a side grade, because you lost damage, you lost defensive utility, and instead you get a lot of disruption when you master this. But until it's mastered, this is just a nerf compared to the old Pirouette, in my opinion. Like, the old Pirouette unmastered was better, 100% in my opinion. Now you really need to master this to get at least some value. It's still not as good as old Pirouette mastered, I think, but that's arguable, because double daze, double weekend is very good. It's still a huge loss though, because a lot of the old lines don't work anymore, because Fade, Lunge still puts you in Stealth, but it's less flexible now, because you need to Pirouette, because otherwise you will take that daze and that weekend, and that's not great. So you are less flexible, and your lines kind of lock you into like the next 2 actions if you like to dance. Now, another big change, Flashing Daggers. Flashing Daggers deals a bit more damage and targets the back 3 ranks. It now requires you to have Stealth and remove Stealth on you, and it has a cooldown. And if you master this, it deals a bit more damage, and you have a 50% chance to remove Stealth on yourself instead of being guaranteed. This is technically an overall damage increase, because 3 to 5 against 2 is worse than 3 to 5 against 3. That's basically all I can say. Because before you never really cared about Flashing Daggers, this was kind of like a whatever move. Because this before targeted rank 2 and rank 3, and you had either Glint in the Dark, Thrown Dagger, or just Lunge. And all of those already covered that 2 to 3, so Flashing Daggers was just never an option. Right now I think Flashing Daggers isn't great either. Like, it might seem good, and if you play it first it seems like very cool, because like you get strength and then you hit 3 enemies and you kill 3 enemies. That's like fantastic, right? But if you crunch the numbers and you just compare this to Aspirant Anamnesis, Anamnesis is just better in terms of numbers. It's less consistent, because obviously you have to set up with Chaotic Offering, which is like the random side effect exists, and like the self-damage is a thing. But Anamnesis with plus 150% damage deals about the same on hit damage. It deals 3 to 5 unmastered. You get the bleed on top. It hits rank 4. So it's like, why? Like, from just numbers, Anamnesis is straight up better than Flashing Daggers every time. Because with Flashing, you still have to set up, and you have to use 1 action to set up basically, and your second action is Flashing Daggers. And with Anamnesis, it's like you press Chaotic Offering, and then you press Anamnesis. And if you crunch the numbers, which I did, so I'm just gonna read them, or like put them on screen here maybe. But basically, Flashing deals a total of 9 to 15 damage, unmastered, against 9 to 15, because it's 3 to 5 against 3 enemies, right? Makes sense. And then Anamnesis deals 3 to 5 against 4 enemies, and a 3-point bleed on top. So this is a total of 12 to 20 on hit, without the bleed. 12 to 20 total damage. And 24 to 32 with a single bleed proc on everybody. And if you get all the 3 bleed 50 procs on everybody, which obviously won't happen in a normal game, you deal 48 to 56 damage. The only thing Flashing Daggers deals better than an Amnesis on Aspirant is that you have a slightly more consistent setup. It's less risky because it's not Chaotic Offering, it's just like press Shadow Fade or Repartee, and you have 5% more crit. But that Amnesis is still better because it hits rank 4, it hits everybody, and you just deal more damage overall. And an Amnesis isn't great. Like, I'm not arguing that like an Amnesis is just straight up better than Flashing Daggers. That's not my point. My point is that you can compare Flashing Daggers to an Amnesis and it's close how good they are. And that's a very bad sign, because an Amnesis is one of the worst moves in the game. And if you have to get into like into a very, very close fight with one of the worst moves in the game, you have to justify that you are slightly better than one of the worst moves in the game. That's terrible. Like, that's atrocious. Like, if this was compared to like, let's say, I don't know, let's pick like any very good move, like let's say Plague Grenade, right? Like Flashing Daggers like doesn't deal as much damage as Plague Grenade. It's like slightly better than Plague Grenade. Like, nobody cares. Like, because Plague Grenade is a great move, but an Amnesis isn't. An Amnesis is not a good move. And you have to compare Flashing Daggers to an Amnesis, and you have to jump through hoops to argue that Flashing Daggers is better than an Amnesis. That's not a good sign. Like, this sucks. Like, it's better than old Flashing Daggers, which was not a difficult comparison. You didn't run Flashing Daggers at all, under no circumstance. And now you can sometimes argue that, yeah, you want Flashing Daggers because it's like a big cleave and it allows you to like get out of stealth and use stealth with Repartee, which is obviously a fair point. But being better than old Flashing Daggers is not a big hurdle. And that does not mean that new Flashing Daggers is good, because it's not. It's straight up like, it's at best a slightly below average move. That's not great. That's just not worth it. Like, if you want to build around Flashing Daggers,
to know the abyss,
why wouldn't you build around an Amnesis? Why wouldn't you? Because this is just better. Because you have to like play around the inconsistencies, and then this is just a bigger payoff. And nobody does that. Nobody plans around Aspirant running Amnesis. Nobody does that. If you pick Aspirant, it's because of the extra HP and just sitting in the back. And Amnesis is just not used. Like, you don't equip an Amnesis on Aspirant very often because it's not good. And that's kind of the point where like you have to see that Flashing Daggers isn't great. And it's just straight up not worth it. And if you master this, I guess it's better because you don't remove stealth sometimes, and like, sure, it's better damage. But then again, like, an Amnesis upgrade is still just way better than this, so yeah. Like, Flashing Daggers is not like a big game changer for this. Like, this doesn't change that the path is bad. So, one of the biggest nerfs in probably all of the, not in all of the Darkest Dungeon University, but this is a very, very big nerf. Lunge. I just don't get this. I don't understand this. The first nerf, Lunge got a few changes. The first one is that it's the only move that has the plus 50% damage when you are stealthed. Okay, so you kept it on your main damage move, sure. So you didn't completely nuke old Nightsworn. You didn't get any of the other moves, which kind of removes every other avenue of damage, which is very bad. It's like saying, oh yeah, Highwayman, we nerfed Sharp Shot by destroying all of his range moves, and only Pistol Shot deals damage now. What? That's a bad change, right? Because now you have only one option to deal damage, and everything else is just gone. And that's basically what happened, because Lunge is like the only thing that kept the plus 50% damage when you're stealthed. Not great already. The second nerf is the max damage got lowered. Lunge before used to be 5 to 10 and 7 to 13, I think. And the max damage range might seem like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter too much, right? Like, if you can't high roll as big, so like, it's not that bad. Because it's not like an overall range decrease, it's just like, it makes the range tighter. Which, like, sure. But Grave Robber with Lunge was very, very crit reliant. Like, you wanted plus crit on her as much as possible. That's why the crit rate on this really matters. So 30% crit allows this to like crit very consistently, and if you get like a big quirk like Deadly, this is just like a 45% insta crit. And that's huge. And that's why the top range for this really mattered, because Grave Robber was already aligned on crits to make her damage with Lunge work, and now you kind of took that away. because now your crits are less powerful. And that's not great, because if you don't know how crits work, you take the max damage range and you add 50% on top of that, and that's your crit damage. So losing that bit of top damage really matters. Like, it might not seem like a big deal, but it really is. Like, this is more painful than it might seem. And now, another change. When you mastered Lunge before, Lunge Plus, you didn't have to execute. Lunge Plus got an execute 1. And instead, you had an ignore block if you weren't stealth. This swap is horrible. Like, this is straight up not good. Because execute 1 is completely irrelevant in her kit. Because if you look at this move, Glint in the Dark, execute 1, same reach. If you look at the upgrade, oh, this ignores stealth, that removes stealth, this still has execute 1. And if you are stealthed, you execute 3, aka you completely ignore all Death's Door. No enemy has more, can survive and execute 3 with Death Armor. That's just not possible. So, the only thing that Lunge actually executes, if you don't run Glint in the Dark, obviously, but if you run Glint in the Dark, which is very common because Glint is a very good move, it's just very flexible, it has 1 to 3, which is very good reach, from the front line, which is kind of where she wants to be very often, or like where she does most of her stuff. Because after Lunge, most of the time you have at least one enemy at low HP, and then you really want Glint in the Dark. You don't want Pick because bad reach, and you can't run Thorn Dagger from the front. So that's kind of why Glint in the Dark is really nice. So unless you don't run this, Lunge execute 1 is kind of worthless. Unless you are sitting in rank 4, or you have an enemy that has exactly 1 token left on him, and still has a good amount of HP, where Lunge actually deals more damage than Glint and is the only way to consistently kill. Then this matters. But compared to old Lunge, where you had the block piercing, so the only case where this Lunge is better than old Lunge is either when you don't run Glint, or the enemy doesn't have any block generation, because if you have block generation, old Lunge is straight up better, because you ignore the block and you instantly kill them. And there's only one enemy that has 1 Death Armor and doesn't generate block. And that's Bullseye Barret. That's one enemy in the Tangle where the block piercing is fantastic, because literally everything in there generates block. So that's already not a great look. Like, if you argue that, like, oh yeah, the execute is actually very helpful because you don't run Glint, sure, fair. I would still run Glint, that's why I think the execute doesn't matter, but fair. But you can't argue that the block piercing was not important. The block piercing was part of the reason why Nightsworn Lunge was so good. Because you could ignore literally every token, because ignoring dodge is kind of, it's kind of whatever, because you have combat items, and you can just throw 2 combat items and like all of the dodge is instantly gone, and it's like, yeah, then the dodge ignore doesn't matter. But the block ignore really matter, because you don't have a good way to get rid of block, and that's why a lot of cleaves that wouldn't really see play, or like would just be kind of bad, like Confessor, a Hand of Light is one of my favorite moves, because it just clears 2 block in the front line, where block is very common. And these kind of cleaves don't exist as much, because Dragonfly is one of them, but most of the time these don't exist. Like, you don't have a lot of good ways to get rid of block. So, especially not as much as dodge, because with dodge you just throw like an AoE combat item, it's like dodge gone, but as like a free action. But with block you can't really do that. So block piercing actually really matters, and it allowed her to like fade and instantly just destroy something that had block on them. Like block plus, like those corpse eaters, destroyed. Like half the HP, or even all the HP if you had like a good damage build, they just fell over. Like, that was horrifying. And the only other enemy that really can, or like the only other hero that can really do this, is Occultist with Burning Stars. And Burning Stars is one of the best moves in the game. Like, this is straight up a huge nuke to any rank that ignores block and is really good. Like, Burning Stars is actually worth the 2-turn setup. And Nightsworn Lunge was kind of in that same range, where it had good damage, I think around the same as upgraded Burning Stars, but it was faster because Nightsworn Graveharber had like 7 speed base. And that's kind of the reason why Lunge had its place, because this was just the faster Burning Stars that had less reach and was a bit less flexible, because you couldn't spam it. With Warlock, you can often just press like Burning Stars into Burning Stars, and that's really good. But not having that anymore really hurts. Like, this move is just straight up not worth it anymore, because if you want a dodge ignore, you run literally any other hero that deals better damage. That doesn't need a 2-turn setup, and you just throw a combat item and done. You just have better lunge. And that's not a great look. Because if you just look at other stuff, like I'm just going back to High Omen Sharp Shot, Pistol Shot, 4 to 8, right? This doesn't seem very good, right? Like, this is lower than lunge. Because lunge is 5 to 8, right? Yeah, 5 to 8. So, in theory, you would say like, oh yeah, Pistol Shot is worse than... Can I? Jesus Christ, I should just put them in here. I didn't know that didn't work. But yeah, you have Fist Shot, like, right. This just seems worse, like 4 to 8, not as good as lunge's 5 to 8, right? The issue is that Grave Robber needs a turn to set up lunge to actually deal better damage, because 5 to 8 doesn't ignore anything. 5 to 8, you have to deal with all the dancing, where with Pistol Shot it's like, you deal 4 to 8, just press this. It's slightly worse, but not by much. And then you have to like set up with like Shadow Fade, you go into Stealth, and then you get a plus 50% damage. But then you'd have to take account of Take Aim, which is like you press Take Aim into Pistol Shot. 12 damage. Yeah. Yeah, it's just not great. Like, this is at max 12 damage with the plus 50% damage run Stealth. And then it's like, this doesn't seem that special anymore, does it? And what made it special before, because if you upgrade this, it's only 7 to 10 damage, and then you had like 15 damage on an enemy. But if an enemy had block, or block plus even, then lunge was straight up better, because you dealt better damage. But that's just not the case anymore. Like, you don't have this. And that's why lunge, new lunge, just kind of doesn't do as much as it used to do. Like, it's not a great burst option anymore. And that's kind of why I dislike the rework in total, because lunging all the time just isn't viable anymore. And the other part of the damage combo, Pirouette, also got kind of nerfed in terms of damage. And that's kind of why these two suck. And all of the surrounding damage pieces also got nerfed. And it's like, so much damage got removed, and your main damage moves aren't dealing as much as before. So like, what do? Like, Nightsworn is the flexible role with a variety of stealth-oriented offense. Offense specifically. The counter defense is a good point, and we'll get to that later. But offense. Where's my offense? It got nerfed. It got removed. Why? Is there like a good reason to why Nightsworn was like off the charts? In terms of like balance? In terms of numbers? No, it wasn't. Like, I don't think anyone would argue like Nightsworn was broken and like needed a nerf right now. Like, I think the general agreement around Nightsworn was kind of like, yeah, it's a good path, you build around it, and it has great ups, but it is very fragile and kind of risky to play, which I think that's true, but it just doesn't have that anymore. Like, you don't have the upside, and like the downside is still pretty much there, because you have 20% more max HP. That's not gonna solve anything. Like, that big of an offense cut is never worth it. But yeah, moving on from lunge, we have Repartee. This move is one of the highlights of this rework, in my opinion. Repartee before was kind of bad on Nightsworn because you never wanted to go out of stealth. But now it is actually quite fun. It applies taunt to someone else, which no other hero really does. And this sets up your stealth in a different way. Where like you get the stealth for your own turn, so all of your plus damage and like the flash daggers you can use, and you can use throw dagger for like the buy paralysis. Sure. And then you remove stealth at the end of turn, which kind of removes the defensive aspect, which, okay, fair payoff. But the issue I still have with this move is that the payoff for stealth, or like the stealth that removes stealth from you, is not worth it. Because you have exactly one move, and that's flashing daggers. And I've already talked about why flashing daggers isn't very good. So this just kind of sucks because of like the surrounding kit, not because of it's a bad move. I think this move is very fun. That applying taunt to someone else is a very fun mechanic. It gives you tempo, and it gives you stealth, which base Shadow Fade doesn't really do. And if you pair it with someone that has Riposte, like Wanderer Duelist, then that can be very fun. And I think this is a very good move with a lot of potential. It just needs something to really take advantage of the basically temporary stealth. Where like, if you want to set up stealth and just... I think the better setup move right now is still Shadow Fade, because Repartee really has an advantage where like, if you spend your stealth, then Repartee is way better. But if you just want to stay in stealth and you just want to use something like Lunge or Thrown Dagger, I think Shadow Fade is better. Especially when it's mastered. But Repartee has its place, it just needs a bit of time, and a big Flesh and Daggers buff would be welcome. Now, Throne Dagger. This got nerfed. Like, it's just not good anymore. Like 3 to 6, it got a damage increase, I think. Before it was like a bit lower. I think it was 3 to 5 or something. It wasn't like a huge damage increase, but it was a small. Let me just check. Yeah, I just checked. Throne Dagger went from 3 to 5 damage to 3 to 6, and 4 to 7 to 4 to 8. Very small damage increase. It's like the top range got +1, which, sure, it helps the crits a bit, but it isn't a huge deal. And the reason why I think this still got nerfed, even with the damage increase, is because now you don't have to plus 50% damage while you're on stealth. And that's horrible. Like, Throne Dagger before was actually really nice, because if you just look at the numbers, it was like 3 to 5, plus 50% damage. Just think about that. You deal 4 to 5 to 7.5, which is a lot better than what it is right now. And if you upgrade this, this was straight up better. Like, you dealt 6 to, I'm just gonna say 12? 6 to 12? That's pretty good damage. 6 to 12 is a lot, right? Like, barely any heroes reach that. Like, Pistol Shot obviously kinda does because of take aim, but 7 to 10. And that was still pretty special. Like, old Throne Dagger wasn't bad damage on Nightsworn. You never really cared about Throne Dagger too much because it wasn't as good as Lunge. And if you just wanted to spam Throne Dagger, you kinda had that eye, which was just more consistent. This was like dealing damage all the time. But this was still like a good burst option. Now it doesn't really have that anymore, because you just deal 3 to 6 and ignore dodge and taunt obviously if you're on stealth. But losing 50% damage for this? Especially because you already had the dodge ignore. And yeah, it's not great anymore. And the taunt ignore is whatever. Like, I don't think anyone can tell me which enemies generate taunt. Because the only one I can think of is the altar buff in Act 3. And that's it. Like, the rest, I can't think of any enemy that generates taunt. Like, I just can't think of anyone. And the guard piercing it had before is like, sure, like losing that wasn't a big deal because very few enemies had guard anyway. There were a few big ones like Drummer, against which new Throne Dagger on Nightsworn is worse. But like there weren't a lot of them anyway. Like it's a small, it basically traded one niche for an even more niche upside. And that's not great, especially because the damage got nerfed this hard. So this is like an actual cope change, it's just a nerf. For Nightsworn specifically, it's obviously good for like Deadeye, Wanderer, Venom Drop, but for Nightsworn this is a huge nerf in comparison. Now that's pretty much all the changes Nightsworn specifically got, and now I'm getting to like the stuff that Wanderer also got that also affects Nightsworn. Absinthe, it heals better now, it has a higher threshold at 33% instead of the 25% it had before. Sure, this is a nice change, it gives a bit of extra survivability. You kinda still want to run Dead of Night over it a lot of the time because this gives you stealth. And Nightsworn is all about stealth, so yeah, this is probably a preferred option. Especially your Master, this is 50% healing, -1 stress, and 2 stealth. This is very good if you get a quick kill. But Absinthe has its place against bosses where like, yeah, you don't generate corpses from Dead of Night, so Absinthe is just the better option. Now, Glint in the Dark also got changed. You got a small damage increase. Let me just check how much it was. Where is it? Yeah, Glint in the Dark went from 4 to 6 to 4 to 7, and from 6 to 8 to 6 to 9. You lost plus 50% damage. Yeah, I think that explains enough why I think this is a nerf, and just not great. Now, I think Glint in the Dark is still worth running, but this is just a nerf. Like, the damage got lower overall. Painted Face also got a buff. This has like the option where like if you crit when it's mastered, you remove all block from the enemy. And the damage also got slightly lowered from 4 to 10 to 4 to 9, which is whatever. I think it got a crit increase, but you never care about this anyway. At best, this is a 70% chance to remove a block. And no, if you bring it specifically for that, or you bring pick specifically for that, don't. It's not a great move. It never has been. Never run this, and it's not great. Another change is Fade. Shadow Fade Plus now generates a strength token instead of the speed token used to do. This is a good change. Fate Plus was kind of a meme before because it did nothing. Because you just had 7 speed Grave Robber, which pretty much outsped a lot of enemies. There's some that it didn't outspeed, obviously, but you at least speed tied them. And that was good enough. And like, the speed token barely did anything in most fights. But the strength token is really good. It allows you to set up for more damage, but this is pretty much the only thing that I would say is just a straight upgrade, except Repartee. But Shadow Fate is like the really good upgrade, and I might consider mastering this now, because the damage is kind of lower than her other stuff, but it's just a band-aid on like a huge wound. Like, this is still terrible. So, that was all the changes to Nightsworn. In my opinion, I think Nightsworn got way worse. Like, her damage is completely funneled into lunge, basically. Her other stuff just straight up sucks. Like, Pick is bad for damage, Throne Dagger is worse for damage. This is... I can't even explain. And apparently that's never an option anyway. This got nerfed in terms of damage, this got nerfed in terms of damage, this got nerfed in terms of damage. Like, what is happening? The only move that got objectively buffed in terms of doing damage is Flashing Daggers. Everything else got nerfed. Huh? Why? Why did this happen? How did this get through testing? What happened? Like, that's just not a thing. It lost its identity pretty much, because before its identity was lunge, piercing literally every token, nuking an enemy turn 1 or turn 2, no matter what they were. That was really good. But now you don't have that anymore, because lunge doesn't pierce block anymore. Instead you have execute. You know. So there's some better utility. Repartee utility is actually very good, but it doesn't have like a big payoff for that temporary stealth. Flashing Daggers is technically better, but like, it's still not great, because just clearing tokens in the backline without anything else and like requiring a specific move to set you up is not great. So like, it's just cope most of the time. Like, if you think like Nightsworn got a lot better, it just didn't. Like, the damage got nerfed, you got very mediocre utility in return, and it changed nothing. Like, at worst, or like at best, if you think like new Nightsworn is way better than before, you either didn't play old Nightsworn correctly, because you didn't use Shadow Fate into lunge, or like Encore combined with Shadow Fate, or you just are coping out of your mind. Like, new Nightsworn is not great with all of these changes. It's just not worth it. Hey, it's editing name here. I kind of watched this part for like the next 6 minutes. I just went off and was completely confused at Nightsworn changes. And I don't think that is fun to watch. I didn't have a good time watching that. I was just like, what was I doing? I was just yapping. I was just smacking my gums. But yeah, summarized, I have no idea why they changed Nightsworn like this. Like, I guess they are lowering the power level of heroes, but Nightsworn is not where you should start. And Nightsworn being this weak sets a terrible precedent for the rest of the heroes. Like, if every hero gets nerfed this hard, it's like remotely viable, because Nightsworn wasn't like the meta. It was good in specific teams. But like, if every hero gets nerfed like this, Leper is gone, man. Like, Occultist, removed. Like, the entire roster is just gone at that point. Like, if they do this, the entire meta is completely different. Like, I don't think this is a good idea, and I don't think this is how you should approach this. And I've actually found an argument against like why Nightsworn got changed like this. It's because like they are lowering the entire power level, and Nightsworn still feels good to play, which I disagree. You can't do nearly as much dancing as before. There's no real highs like before, where like you just had like a 80% chance crit rate Great Robe with lunge just hitting for 40. Like, you can't get that as easily anymore. And that was part of the fun. And that's what made Nightsworn feel so good. And you just don't have that anymore. I don't understand that point, really, because I think Nightsworn is way less fun now, because one, it's less good, so you feel like you are putting in a lot of work, and the payoff is like, and I think that's why Nightsworn got so didn't get changed for this long, because Nightsworn was pretty much in this state ever since the start of Paths. And yeah, I think Nightsworn should have stayed as is. It was actually a good path in my opinion. I completely disagree with changing Nightsworn. In my opinion, Nightsworn is one of the few paths where you could just one-to-one copy the things from before, from the old path system, transfer them over, and the path would feel fine. Maybe change some of the range stuff. Poison Dart is obviously still completely dead. Repartee needed some work, which they did. So a lot of the damage moves I don't think should have been changed, and if you are lowering the entire power level, I don't think changing Lunge in this way is the way. Especially not if you also remove her entire damage, because a big part of Nightsworn, and the reason why it should be still good, is that you had so many different ways of dealing damage. Of course, if you want to remove like, oh, Nightsworn, second action, you instantly launch something, it instantly kills it. Sure, I think that's fine. If you think that's too OP, sure. I don't think it's too broken, especially comparing it to the other stuff. But if you want to lower the overall power level, sure, you can go with that Lunge nerf. It feels terrible. I think you should instead just lower the damage range, just put it down to like 4 or something, and keep the rest. And especially keep the block piercing, because the block piercing is a huge deal. Now you could lower this to like pistol shot damage, which if you think pistol shot is too broken and like Nightsworn damage should be worse than pistol shot, what are you doing? Like, I think Red Hook has shown the power level that it should be at, because we have Sharp Shot, new pistol shot, which is not that different. So like, why are we also removing the block piercing? That doesn't make sense to me. Especially because we also nerfed the entire rest of the kit that Nightsworn had. Like, all of her range stuff before was like decent damage. You didn't really focus on it. You just had it as backup. And now you just don't. Like, you have nothing. Like, you just have your dancing, which got extremely bad. And then you have your ranged, which also got extremely bad. Like, losing 50% damage on pretty much everything is an insane nerf. Like, that's insane. Like, you can't just do that to a path. Like, that completely kills the path. That's like if you take old Sharp Shot and you just say like, oh yeah, Sharp Shot, we are decreasing your damage to minus 25% range damage. Like the plus 25%. Because that's what happened to Nightsworn. Like, that is insane. If that's the nerf you want to go with, I completely disagree. Like, if you think the power level should be this low, you need to nerf enemies. Like, there's no way around that. Because if every hero gets to the power level that Nightsworn is at right now, I don't think the game is ever going to be fun. Because the game is just going to feel oppressive. Because the enemies are so much stronger then. Because you can't one-tap anything. And it's like, Nightsworn just got, like, losing 50% damage on every move that isn't your main damage source, and even that main damage source got nerfed. It's horrible. Like, you can't do that. Like, it's like saying, oh yeah, PD, your blights, yeah, we are removing them. Like, PD without blights is basically what Nightsworn became. Like, that's a huge damage decrease, and you can't do that. Like, that's just not it. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this video. I'm just gonna make the outro this way because the other outro is completely fucked. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this. Leave a subscribe, like, who cares? You probably doesn't agree with me because I think that I'm pretty alone on this stance that like nerfing Nightsworn this hard is a mistake, but oh well. It is what it is. Hope you had a good time and learned something maybe. And please, please, please reconsider that Nightsworn is good.